The Pathans by Olaf Caroe. Audiobook. Chapter 6. The White Huns. Up to the end of the 4th century AD, all the invaders of Gandhara after Achaemenian times, with the single exception of Alexander himself, had been Iranians, either from metropolitan Persia or from nomadic peoples such as Pathans, Sakas and Kushans dwelling on the fringe of the Iranian world. Even the Greco-Bactrians were Iranians with an Hellenic veneer. But there now starts a great migration of wild barbaric tribes from the heart of the Asian continent. These are the so-called White Huns, referred to in the Greek and Roman writers as Ephthalites or Chionites. These pedantic names they obtain from Greek transcriptions of the Chinese Yeti Ilido and of the Middle Persian Kion for a Hun. In Old Arabic and Persian chroniclers and geographers, they are referred to as the Hayatila or Hayatila. The only sources regarding the early movements of the Ephthalites or White Huns are Chinese, and it is not until they cross the Hindu Kush on their southward migrations that they are mentioned by classical or Arab and Persian writers. Although Vincent Smith equates them with the Huns of Attila, the Chinese carefully distinguish the Yeti Ilido or Hephthalites from the Xiongnu or Huns proper. Procopius, a contemporary, states in his De Bello Persico that they were entirely different from the Huns as known to the Romans, in being the only Huns to have white skins and regular features. The Chinese sources suggest that they did not speak either Mongolian or Turkish, so differing linguistically from the Hunnish groups occupying Zungaria, whence both Huns proper and Hephthalites came. One Chinese authority, according to McGovern, describes them as ultimately of the same origin as the Yuezhi or Kushans, but this seems doubtful. The best conclusion to be drawn from these contradictions would seem to be that the Hephthalites' close proximity to the true Huns of Turkic stock must have led to much ethnic and linguistic intermingling, and may even have caused them to take pride in belonging to the Hunnish family. At the same time, in their position in northern Turkestan on the fringe of Turan and Iran, they represented a nomadic stock open to both influences and possibly may even have been bilingual. A Turco-Iranian compound is more than possible. Indeed, the civilization of Bukhara and Samarkand before the Russians came represents a standing example of it. We need look no further than the Emperor Babur himself and Akbar, his grandson, for its most renowned representatives in history. More often than not, a conclusion of this sort is nearer the truth than any clear-cut assumption of racial purity. It is the sort of conclusion we shall inevitably arrive at in the case of the Afghans and Pathans themselves. The Hephthalites are first heard of as the vassals and auxiliaries of the Avars who established an empire with its centre in Mongolia during the 4th century AD. The Avars probably spoke a Mongol language, and their ruler assumed the title of Khagan or Khan, a title which the Hephthalites brought with them on their travels from Central Asia. While they borrowed the main features of their tribal organisation from their Avar overlords, it is certain that they were a separate people with a different linguistic and cultural background, and that their migrations were prompted by a desire to escape from a too exacting Avar domination. They overran both Kashgaria, the modern Xinjiang, and Sogdia, the modern Samarkand, and turned southward about AD 360 to attack the Kushans of Bactria. The Kushan rulers put up a desperate resistance, but, after vainly appealing for aid to Sassanian Persia, were forced southeastward under a leader named Kidara into Gandhara, where, as we know, their Kushan cousins had for long ruled but were now subject to Sassanian overlords. These Kidarites, sometimes known as the Little Kushans, have not infrequently been regarded as the first wave of White Hun conquest from the north, and referred to as the Chionites. But it seems fairly certain that Kidara and his successors were Kushans of the true Scythian stock evicted by the Ephthalites from Bactria. Kidara succeeded in wresting the control over Gandhara and adjacent regions from the last of the Sassanian Kushan Shahs, who died about AD 365. He himself assumed the title of Kushan Shah, possibly even enjoying Sassanian recognition. The duration of Kiddarite rule in Gandhara is uncertain, but the evidence of coins, which show more than one ruler of this name, suggests that it may have been as much as 100 years. The whole region was then finally overwhelmed by an irresistible surge of the Ephthalites, or White Huns proper, which in the east blooded right across northern India, and in the west came within an ace of destroying the Sassanian Empire of Persia itself. The Hephthalites completed their occupation of Bactria in about AD 425, and from that centre proceeded to raid heavily both towards Persia in the southwest and southeast in the direction of the Kabul Valley and Gandhara. Their first forays against Persia were stayed in AD 427 by the renowned Sassanian ruler Bahram V, surnamed Gur, hunter, lover and minstrel. Bahram Gur, feigning to buy them off with gold, lay in ambush and destroyed the Ephthalite army to a man. This check was effective for a generation. But on the succession of Bahram's grandson, Firuz, after the middle of the 5th century, the tide turned. Firuz had called in the Ephthalites as kingmakers to unseat a younger brother, and mutual dissatisfaction led to war. In a series of heavy battles, he was first made captive, and in the end, in AD 484, met his death. The pride of Sassanian Persia was humbled, and she came to occupy a tributary position to the Ephthalites ruler, which lasted well on into the 6th century. But the Ephthalites were too closely occupied elsewhere to administer to Persia the final coup de grace. The slackening of their pressure on the Sassanians was undoubtedly due, at least in part, to their having become deeply involved in what seemed to them a more profitable adventure in the direction of India. This they began by the invasion of Gandhara, where they overcame Kidara's successors about AD 455. They were accompanied on this incursion by a sort of vassal or helot group of tribes named the Gujars. In Gandhara they appointed a Targin or viceroy, nominally subordinate to the Ephthalite supreme ruler in Bactria. This viceroy, or possibly his successor, is identifiable with the Toramana of the Indian Gupta inscriptions. Before long, Toramana and his son Mihiragula, both known to legend as infamous and bloodthirsty tyrants, had overrun the Punjab, destroyed the Gupta Empire of the Hindus, and become the paramount rulers of all northern and central India. They established their capital at Sakala, the modern Sialkot. The cruelties of Mihiragula are recounted not only in Hindu story, but by the Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Sung Yun and by a Byzantine monk who visited the north at this period. In the end, his oppression led to rebellion and the defeat of the Ephthalites, who only with difficulty retained a small footing in the north. Mihiragula took refuge in Kashmir, where he inaugurated another reign of terror which lasted until his death in AD 542. The Kashmiris have a legend that he delighted in pitching elephants over a cliff and watching their death agonies. The scene of this carnage is still shown on the southern side of the Pir Panjal Pass close to the summit, on the road followed by the Mughals in their annual visits to Kashmir more than 1,000 years later. The main body of the Ephthalites who had remained in Bactria did not long survive the breaking of their power in the Indus Valley. In about the middle of the 6th century, the Turks, who had succeeded the Ephthalites as vassals of the Avars, rose in rebellion against their overlords and made themselves masters of northern Turkestan. There followed strained relations between the victorious Turks and the Ephthalites of Bactria, leading to hostilities. At this time, Khusrau I Anushirvan, the Just, had begun his long reign in Sassanian Persia, and, although checked by Belisarius on the Euphrates, had succeeded in the course of warfare with Roman Byzantium under the great Justinian in doing something to revive the repute of Persian arms. The rise of Turkish power on the other side of the Bactrian Ephthalites gave Khusrau his opportunity to deal finally with those who had humbled Persia for 3 generations. Sassanians and Turks made a joint attack on the Ephthalite kingdom and destroyed it in a decisive battle in Sogdiana, dated by Menander Protector, the Byzantine historian, in AD 568. The episode is described in the section of the Shahnameh of the Persian poet Ferdowsi, devoted to Khusrau Anushirvan. Ferdowsi names the Ephthalites Hayatila. Once again, then the Sassanian power could be extended, at least nominally, to the Indus and all eastern Iran. The modern Afghanistan passed into their hands. But the Hephthalites themselves did not disappear with their empire. It is probable that among other legacies they left the title of Khan, now a hallmark not only among Pathans but all over the Punjab and beyond, where there persists any consciousness of a Central Asian origin. It seems likely, too, that certain terms originating in Mongolia and carried southward by Turkic migrations into Pathan usage date from this time. Such are the word ulus for the tribe, baramta for a raid on an enemy's person, or flocks to indemnify oneself for a wrong, hashar for a helping party of friends at harvest time. All words in common use in Paktu, but not of Iranian origin. With the Hephthalites, moreover, as all agree, came in the Gujars, and when the Ephthalite power fell, the Gujar people remained. And it has been asserted that the Jats of the Punjab, the main stream from whom the rural Sikhs are drawn, and even many of the proud Rajput clans, are descended from these invading White Huns. If this is so, it would indeed be strange if the Hephthalites had left no traces in the population of the Peshawar plain. The origin of the Rajputs may well be germane to our present problem, and Vincent Smith has much to say that is of interest. After recalling that before the Muslim invasions, the three main eruptions of foreigners through the northwestern passes were the Sakas, the Kushans, and the White Huns. He points out that the real difference between the ancient and the medieval periods of Indian history is that at some period the living tradition was broken. There is, in fact, no tradition concerning the ancient period. The Mauryas, the Sakas, the Kushans belong to a dead and buried past, known only from inscriptions and coins. The tradition of the Rajput clans, on the other hand, is very much alive, and they still form influential sections of the people. The break came, Vincent Smith believes, with the third eruption, the White Hun invasions of the 5th century. This incursion was so overwhelming that it destroyed all memory of descent from the first and second swarms, the Sakas and Kushans. It was like the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain, creating a dark age. He goes on. Who were these Rajputs, and why do they and their affairs make such a stir during the centuries before the Mohammedan conquest? Their dominance is the conspicuous fact differentiating the medieval from the ancient period in the history of North India, and the mind craves for an explanation. It seems to be clearly established that the Hun group of tribes and hordes made their principal settlements in Rajputana and the Punjab. The most important element in the group after the Huns themselves was that of the Gujars, whose name survives in the form of a Gujar, as the designation of a widely diffused class in northwest India. The Jats, or Jats, more exclusively agricultural. The Gujars are a pastoral people, are universally recognized as akin to the Gujars. The discovery that the Rajas of Kanauj, Parihas, from 800 to 1018, some of whom enjoyed the rank of paramount sovereign of North India, really were the descendants of foreign immigrants of the 5th and 6th centuries and cousins of the Gujars, though recognized as high-class Rajputs, is one of the most notable additions made to Indian historical knowledge for many years past. A fair presumption arises that many of the Rajput clans were of similar origin. The truth seems to be that, when a foreign clan became Hinduized, the ruling families were readily recognized as Kshatriyas or Rajputs, while the rank and file of the strangers became Gujars and other castes ranking lower in the scale of precedence. Now, let us see how this line of argument bears on the origin of the Pathans. Gandhara, the Peshawar Valley, was the point d'appui of the White Huns or Ephthalites in their invasion of North India. There are literally thousands of Gujars in the villages of Swat, Dir, and Mardan today. One of the largest of all villages in the Yusufzai Samar of Mardan is named Gujargahi. Many of the villages under the northern hills of Sudam, which separate the Sama from Buna, are populated entirely by Gujars, save only that the Khan and his family are Pathans, having the Gujars under them as tenants, just as the Gujaras served the Ephthalites. The appellation Khan is claimed by every Pathan as of right. It is inconceivable that a conquering race such as the Ephthalites, which left proved descendants down in India among the Rajputs, did not contribute also to the blood of the peoples of Gandhara, which was one of their headquarters. It is to be remembered too that, as we shall see, after the collapse of the Hephthalites, followed shortly after by the fall of the Sassanian Empire before Islam, Gandhara and its environs came under Hindu rule for some 4 centuries. During that long period, there were no successful invasions from the northwest, and the people had time to settle down. Nor need we forget that these White Huns, in Procopius's phrase, were fine-looking men with white skins and regular features. Long before these discoveries of Ephthalites and Gujaras had been coordinated, Bellew had pointed to what he calls a very remarkable similarity between the national character and customs of the Afghans and of the Rajputs. He mentions the rigid law of hospitality, the protection given to the refugee, the jealousy of female honour, the warlike spirit and insufferance of control, the pride of race, the jealousy of national honour and personal dignity, the spirit that loves to domineer. He finds also facial resemblances, and most who know both peoples would agree. The two peoples, he concludes, are now parted more by Islam and Brahmanism than by territorial distance or personality. And here is a quotation to bear this out. In many ways the Rajput bears such a strong resemblance to the Highlanders of Scotland that one might seem to be reading one of Walter Scott's stories, with some trifling differences of names and costumes. They had the same reckless daring, the same loyalty to a chief they trusted, the same love of sport, the same readiness to take offence and quarrel among themselves when they could find no enemy to give them employment. After all these centuries, the Rajput bearing remains what it was in their heroic age, something that marks him out from all other races. The poorest is by birth a gentleman, and therefore the equal of the greatest. To see a Rajput on horseback clattering through the streets that his ancestors cleared with the sword is to realise a scene from the legends when Prithvi Raj went forth at the time of the year when kings go to battle. Substitute Afghan for Rajput and Ahmad Shah for Prithvi Raj, and the picture fits exactly. We have seen possible prototypes of Pathan clan names emerging hundreds of years before the Ephthalite incursions. We have noted also that the best linguists believe the ancestor of the Pakhtu language to have come in not later than the Sakas, 4 centuries before the Hephthalites arrived. But it seems to me certain that whatever the underlying strata, the White Hun dominance must have contributed another layer to the composition of the people of these parts. Just as the Gujaras, the Helots of the White Huns, are still to be seen as Gujars in thousands in this very region, so their overlords, the Ephthalites, must be among the Khans. My conviction is that many of the Kankalav tribes, such as the Yusufzais, could claim Ephthalite forebears. It is probable that Ephthalites blood is to be found among the Afghans of the plains, such as the Yusufzais, rather than among the Pathans of the hills. In other words, in terms of the genealogies, such traces should be looked for among the sons of Sarban, rather than among the Karlanris. And here will be remembered Bellew's speculation that the Sarbanri genealogies suggest Rajput affinities, as for instance, Sarbana derived from Suryabans, Shahjan from Surjan, and Krishan from Krishan. It is not surprising to find that, with the few exceptional words I have already noted, the language of the Pathans shows no Turkic affinities and remains an East Iranian tongue with borrowings from the Indian group. in cultural matters, including language, the Hunnish conquerors evidently adopted the ways of the conquered, an Iranian heritage from many hundreds of years of civilization. There are further grounds for supposing that the Ephthalites became an important element in the amalgam which constitutes the Afghan world. As we know from the genealogies, the Ghaljis are held to be the sons of Bitan, in the line of Qais, only on the female side through his daughter Bibi Matto, who was seduced by a foreign prince, Hussein. Clearly, this story expresses in mythical form a tradition of foreign invaders who by force or guile seized the women of the country as brides. We noted also a belief, held by some commentators, that this mythical prince might have been Turkish. At least, he was admittedly not Afghan. There has been much discussion on a possible Turkish admixture in the origin of the Ghaljis, mainly going on the opinion of Mahmud Kashgari, writing in Baghdad in the 11th century. The Russian Orientalist Barthold identified the Ghaljis as the Turkish Khalaj, who made up 2 of the 24 clans of the tribal confederacy of the Oghuz, Turks, the first wave of whom moved south of the Oxus in the 10th century and formed an important part of Mahmud of Ghazna's armies. It is supposed that they gradually adopted the Afghan language and customs. Another Russian Orientalist, Reisner, is inclined to endorse this view, which is broadly followed by the Cambridge History of India and by myself in an earlier book. I propose for the present to leave aside the identification of the Khalaj with the Ghalji, considering that point later when we come to the invasions of India by Khalaj mercenaries. Let us now see only who the forerunners of the Khalaj themselves were, if the Khalaj were indeed of Turkish stock, so recently assimilated to Afghan ways at the time of the Ghaznavids in the 10th and 11th centuries, a period for which there exists a large body of contemporary and locally written commentary in Arabic. I think, upon reflection, that statements to that effect could not have failed to appear in the works of the Ghaznavid and later chroniclers. We must go further back and look for a clue to Khalaj origins in earlier waves of conquest. Could they have been descendants of the Ephthalites, a people in a much more distant past than the Guz Turks? It appeared improbable that such a theory could be established by documentary or epigraphical evidence, for as far as it is known, the Hephthalites themselves had no literature, and they do not seem to have gone in for inscriptions or monuments. Nevertheless, the surmise seemed to bring the whole story to life and to be at least as attractive, and surely as reasonable, as Vincent Smith's assignment of an Ephthalite origin to the lordly Rajput. And now light breaks. It will not be forgotten that the Arabic and Persian name for the Ephthalites is Haytal or Hayatila, and they are so mentioned by Ferdowsi in his Shahnameh. In his commentary on the Hudud al-Alam, Professor Minorski quotes 2 early passages from Arab chroniclers which would appear to resolve all doubt. They are A. From the Mafatih al-Ulam of al-Khwarizmi, written probably in AD 975, H 365. The Hayatila are a tribe of men who had enjoyed grandeur and possessed the country of Turkaristan. The Turks called Kaluk or Khalaj are their descendants. B. From the Kitab al-Masalik of Istakri, written about AD 933, H 321, the Khalaj are a kind of Turks who in the days of old came to the country between Hind and the districts of Sistan, behind Gore. They are cattle breeders of Turkish appearance, dress and language. With regard to the first passage, there is continual confusion in the text between Khalaj and Kaluk, for in Arabic the words only differ in one point. There seems no doubt that Khalaj is here meant. Turkaristan is what is now northeastern Afghanistan around Baghlan. The 2 passages, taken together, fit the Ephthalite geographical conquests and identify them with the Khalaj. They take the Khalaj back some 5 centuries before the Guz migrations, making their ancestors the White Huns, the same as the ancestors of so many other dominant people in the north of what was then India. I should perhaps anticipate conclusions here by remarking that the later identification of the Khalaj with the Ghaljis is, I think, established beyond any doubt. The detailed argument must wait for its proper place in the chronological record. There is one more possible connection to be mentioned before leaving the Hephthalites. Writing as much as a century ago, the traveller Masson identifies the Durranis also with the Hephthalites. He says, "The Durranis are known both in India and Persia as Abdali or Avdali, and when we find that the White Huns of ancient history, the Ephthalites of classical authors, were named Hephthals by Armenian authors, we might infer that the Abdali or modern Durranis are no other than descendants of that powerful people. The Siaposh Kafirs remember that their ancestors were driven into the hills from the plains by the Odals, a term they still apply to the inhabitants of the Low Countries. Phonetically, the transference Ephthalites. Avdal seems fair enough, but much more research is needed to establish this link. As it is, the origins of the Abdalis are obscure, and they do not emerge from darkness until the time of Shah Abbas the Great early in the 17th century. However this may be, and Allah knoweth best, by the end of the 6th century AD there emerges a group of tribes with an Iranian background and language, but made up of successive hordes overlaid at the last by a Hunnish conquest, and with a centre of historical attraction in Gandhara or the Peshawar Valley. The later hordes of White Huns had gone for the wide open plains and reached far down into India, leaving the indigenous groups in the less accessible hill country. A pattern something like that in the genealogies begins to be recognisable. The skein is being drawn together, and we approach the Hijri era, the rise of the son of Muhammad's beauty, as the Afghan chronicler has it.